Article 3, on nothing and on being of reason. Since something is not perfectly known unless its opposite is known, we will speak of two notions that are in some way opposed to being. On nothing. Nothing is here understood in respect of existence and not in respect of understanding. So nothing, absolutely speaking, is defined as that to which existence in reality is repugnant. Therefore, it is simply the lack of the idea of being, whether being is understood as actual or potential, and is thus in the same as the impossible. Of this sort, for example, would be chimera, irrational man, etc. Generally speaking, however, everything that does not actually exist, whether it can exist or not, is called nothing. Nothing in this sense, which is also called relative nothing by some, is merely the lack of actual existence. So, for example, a golden mountain, not yet conceived offspring, and the like are nothing. Scholastics say that nothing has only the whatness of the name and lacks all true or real whatness, because an existence of this sort in reality is always and everywhere impossible. On the other hand, if something were merely relative nothing, in that it could exist if God wanted to create it, this sort of thing is said to have a real essence or whatness. Note, on the opposition between being and nothing. Insofar as nothing is understood as non-being, being and nothing seem to be mutually contradictory, such as that can be said of anything. If this is not being, it is nothing. But being is an equivocal name, or if you wish, an analogical name, and although it is understood in the same sense, namely as transcendental being in the way explained above, it can be predicated of any subject in diverse ways, namely the whatness, denominatively, really, formally, per se, per accident, etc. But the above conclusion does indeed follow if being is denied in the same sense as subject is said to be simply non-being, and if, further, being is denied of the same subject as nothing is affirmed. For example, it is plain that nothing does not contradict being as that to which existence is not repugnant unless nothing is understood absolutely and not just relatively. Further, if transcendental being is taken formally, it opposes, as is evident, not only nothing absolutely, but its own proper attributes and intrinsic modes as well. For being is referred to these formally as something potential and determinable to something actually indetermining, or as something modified to its modification. Nevertheless, these notions are not formally nothing, because they express some perfection on the part of the thing that the notion of being does not formally express. Logically speaking, see Aristotle Metaphysics 7:4-5. The subject enters in some way into the definition of its attributes or features, but not in their whatness, and so a subject cannot be predicated of its feature in the first mode of per se predication, in the way that animal, for example, can be predicated in the first mode of man or being of the substance or of God. For the notion of animal enters into the notion as to his whatness, that is, a determinable part in his essential concept, to wit, as his genus, and similarly the notion of being enters into the notion of God or substance, not indeed as genus, but ultimately determinable into the element which the essential notion of God or substance can be resolved. Now, the reason that a subject cannot be predicated in the whatness of its essential attributes and the differences is as follows. An attribute cannot be properly defined, but as Aristotle shows in the passage just cited. For although an attribute cannot be conceived save as related to some subject to which it is attributed, nevertheless this relation is a relation of opposition, namely the relation between a determinable and a determinate, and so involves a certain mutual exclusion if opposite notions are formally considered. Hence the subject, as scholastics say, enters into the definition of attributes as something added, that is, as something really extrinsic and so outside their formal whatness considered in itself. Briefly, then, the notion of transcendental being can be quitatively predicated, and even predicated univocally according to Scotists, of any real concept that is not simply simple, namely of the concept of God, of individuals, of species, of genera, and the like, which we will deal with more fully below. but it cannot be predicated quantitatively of the ultimate differences and proper features of being, but, on the contrary, they can be predicated of transcendental being either in the second per se mode if they are attributes, namely true, good, or finite infinite disjunctively, or per accidens, logically speaking, if they are an ultimate difference of any being, for example, infinite, substantial, finite, etc. But as far as the notion of being enters into this sort of definition, at least as something extrinsically added, being can be predicated of them, namely of infinite, substantial, etc., to the extent that these notions are taken denominatively, that is, insofar as these concepts directly supposit for their subject, namely being, and indirectly connote infinity or in itselfness respectively, just as we can say that the masculine, denominatively taken, is animal, or that odd is number. Being as a name, then, can equivocally signify both something of which being can be quantitatively predicated, and indeed univocally according to Scotus, and everything that is predicated of transcendental being, for example, an attribute or ultimate difference or intrinsic mode. Indeed, of any intelligible real perfection, it can be simply said that it is a being or not a being, and so either that it is a being or that it is nothing. But it cannot be said that everything is either quantitatively a being or is nothing, nor that everything is simply formally a being or nothing, because there is here a fallacy of simply and in a certain respect. We can, however, say that everything that is in no way a being, whether quantitatively or denominatively, is nothing. In like manner, we cannot say that every perfection on the part of a thing that is not expressed formally by the name of transcendentally is taken and it is nothing. We can, however, concede that all things are nothing if being, when so taken, either cannot be predicated of them quantitatively or cannot be predicated of some subject that includes them at least quantitatively. On being of reason. Etymologically, a being of reason, or a thing of the mind, signifies whose beingness depends in some way on the intellect. In this rather broad sense, being of reason can be understood in three ways. 1. As effect, namely insofar as it depends on the intellect as an effect on its cause. Hence, whatever is elaborated by reason is called a being of reason, as are, for example, ideas in the mind of an artist, abstraction, judgment, attention, etc. 2. In subject, namely insofar as it depends on the intellect as an accident or modification inhering in its proper subject. Hence, whatever inheres in man's mind as its subject, namely the habit of science, wisdom, etc., is a being of reason. 3. As object, namely insofar as the intellect gives it diminished being, as the concept of a concept. Such existence is nothing other than being actually known, and so being of reason signifies the known object as it exists in the knower. Such existence is called object being, or intelligible being, in opposition to real being or being simply. Only in this last sense is real being or being simply opposed to the being of reason. And just as the former is defined as that to which existence is not repugnant, so being of reason can be defined as that to which existing is known is not repugnant. Such existence is also called mental presence, intentional existence, to be known, to exist as the content of a thought, to be a thought object, etc. As will be shown later, every real being can be understood and as such can have known being. Hence, in this sense, every real being as known can be a being of reason, but not every being of reason can exist also in reality. The sort of beings of reason, indeed, that neither have nor can have any existence besides as objects of the mind, are nevertheless conceived as if they were things, are called by some authors beings of reason in the strict sense. So Hickey says, quote, "A being of reason, taken strictly, can be defined as that which the intellect conceives after the manner of being, although it has no beingness in itself," unquote. Beings of reason, strictly speaking, they say, are divided into founded and non-founded, insofar as some foundation of understanding for forming them is found in things, or insofar as they are fashioned without such foundation by the mind. Time and space, they say, are beings of reason without a foundation, with a foundation in reality, but a chimera lacks such a foundation in reality.